in charge.
You are.
Who? Me? I'm hundreds of miles away from home. Don't put me in charge. Hey Dave, having those doors open, is that going to be a problem to the light for the recording? Yeah, you probably ought to. I think that might be a little bit too much light for the recording. Hey, watch, don't make it so dark in here, they're going to go to sleep. They just ate. Before we get started, does anybody need to go downstairs and get some caffeinated coffee? Or anything that might help you to stay awake? Is there any announcement we need to make downstairs in case any more of them want to come up? I'm a little hesitant to start without at least hollering down there one time.
This is your opportunity for a preacher joke.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you about Dave, this guy named Dave. I've heard you've got a lot of Daves in this church.
We do.
Yeah, they're numbered. Dave 1, Dave 2, Dave 3. But anyway, Dave forgot his 25th wedding anniversary. Now, that's not a very good thing for a man to do who's married. His wife was pretty upset toward the end of the day that nothing special happened. I mean, after all, that's a quarter of a century. And so, toward the end of the day, she ripped into him. I've been married to you for a quarter of a century. I've been washing your clothes. I've been cooking your meals. I have raised your kids. This is our 25th wedding anniversary, and you have forgotten. So she starts stomping real hard upstairs. And as she was stomping upstairs, she said, tomorrow morning in the driveway, there better be something red out there that goes from 0 to 60 in less than 6 seconds. So she got up the next day. They didn't sleep in the same room that night. And she got up the next day and she looked out the upstairs window, and sure enough, there was a red box with a white ribbon out on the driveway. She really enthusiastically ran down, because she knew what it was. She ran down the steps, and then she opened that red box with the white ribbon on it. And instead of it being a set of keys, it was a set of bathroom scales that could go from 0 to 200 in way less than 6 seconds. And Dave has not yet been found. So the moral of that story is, don't forget your 25th wedding anniversary. It's not a good thing. Okay. Thank you very much for sticking around today. I'm a big fan of the subject of marriage. I love marriage.
Amen.
I love being married. I love the wisdom that God displayed in giving us the opportunity to live life married. And it doesn't get much sweeter than the blessing of being able to live life married. To have somebody to share your joys with and your positive experiences, and then to have somebody to help you carry the burdens that are going to be experienced in a fallen world. It is such a great blessing to be married. I'm going to confess to you that when I was married, I did not appreciate my marriage as much as I should have. I thought I did. But when my wife died, I came to appreciate marriage even more. You know, the absence of the person, the silence of the person, the lack of companionship, it caused me to really deepen my appreciation for the blessing of marriage. Now, sometimes people have, when they get married, they have bad marriages. And if that marriage ends, then they would love to be married again because they had a bad experience. So they want a better experience. And then there are people who have good marriages, and those marriages end. there's always an end to a marriage, just like there's always a beginning. You just don't know when it's going to be or how it's going to happen. But some people have had really good marriages, and they've lost that blessing because their mate died. And some of them, they don't have an interest in being married the rest of their life because they had such a great, awesome marriage. And then there are other people who've experienced that same loss, and they think, I'd love to have another great marriage. Now, I share that with you to share with you the fact that people are all over the board in regard to this issue of marriage and marriage again after the loss of a marriage, whether it's by divorce or by death. Now, I'm also going to make another confession. I avoided this subject for the first few years after my family started our passion project, the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. I avoided this subject. I didn't want to go there. The reason why I didn't want to go there is because I was very concerned about myself. And I was concerned about myself, me making a very impetuous decision to marry again, because there's human in everybody. And some of us are more inclined to be social and want those relationships than other people. I happen to be one of those kind of people. And so I really made it a point of ignoring the subject and not doing anything about it. It wasn't a part of any workshop I ever did. And then it got to the point where over and over and over again, this subject came up. And I thought, okay, I've got to get to this point. I've got to insert a session about this subject of marriage, but do it in such a way as that people who've never been married could be blessed, and then people who had been married but lost that marriage, they can be blessed as well. So this is that final session. I used to not want to do this one, but now it's become kind of my favorite one. Well, let me start this way. There is a lady in Northeast Ohio that I knew whose husband died suddenly a month before my wife died. And she got married when she was 19 years old to this 23-year-old guy. And they were married for 23 years. One Sunday, she was making breakfast, and she sent her teenage daughter, 13-year-old teenage daughter, down to the basement to get her father to come up for breakfast. And that teenage daughter found her father dead on the floor. Now, this is 2.5 years later. That widow is writing to me, telling me about her thinking in regard to marrying again. I want to read you a section of this email. First of all, it scares me to find about things to read and things to think about. This whole thing about dating, it just scares me. I'm not sure if I can love someone else like I love Gary. I'm very lonely. I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before. If something were to happen to one of us, that we would want the other to remarry. It was easy to say that when he was alive, but now he is gone. It's much more difficult to talk about now. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure that my heart is ready or I'd be able to handle that again. It scares me because I know that if I got married, that if my spouse goes before me again, I don't want to have to live through the pain of losing another spouse. I don't know if I can do it again. That gives you a little bit of insight into the confliction sometimes that we can experience as human beings after the loss of our marriage. Well, sometimes people remarry after their spouse has died and they have great experiences. The Magnolia Messenger is a publication in the Lord's Church from the state of Mississippi. It's the Magnolia State, so the Magnolia Messenger. And in the Magnolia Messenger, this one particular time, it was the spring of 2021, there was an article holding another's hand, it says, after the passing of your mate. And what it is a story about these 3 couples, 6 different people, who each lost their spouse. But then they crossed paths with these other people, and then they became 3 couples. It's a beautiful story. It's like a Hallmark movie script is what it is. And it can be a beautiful thing. Now, the reality is, there's a lot of those beautiful stories. I emailed a brother in the Lord and I said, hey, tell me about what you think about remarriage after loss. He said, my dad died in January of 2013, and there was a man at Mom's church whose wife had died before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the wedding ceremony for Bob and my mom last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. So even when you get older, it can still happen and be good. Well, Bill and Burl Sloan, I met them in Nashville, Tennessee, and after they told me their story, I said, whoa, 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 Burl, I need you to send me that story in writing. So in cursive writing on one page, I have their story. And Burl tells me about her and Bill. Let me read to you a section of this. Bill's wife had ovarian cancer, suffered for over a year. Burl's husband had Parkinson's disease for 10 years. Both of them were faithful caregivers. Both kept their spouses at home until their spouses died. They experienced grieving, and neither one of them had thoughts of remarrying. Right there is an interesting observation. I've had people say, I'm really not interested in being married. And then later, I find out they got married. Never say never. Well, here the story continues. After 14 years of being alone, Bill's son suggested to his dad, Dad, why don't you call Burl to go out on a date? Well, Bill thought about that for a while. Isn't it interesting how children become the parents of their parents? So, Bill gets up the courage to call Burl. And he asked her out on a date. And then he said, she said yes, and I didn't know what to do. I hadn't played this game for a long time. They ended up starting to spend some time together, and they enjoyed one another's company. And then after a while, she said they fell in love and they got married. I love the way she ends this little story. Our lives are so much happier now. God's work can be done together. Isn't that a sweet story? I was in Medina, Ohio, a second workshop I ever did. There was this lady who came to me with a big smile on her face, and she told me the story, and I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, you've got to put that in writing and send it to me. So she sent me an email. And she says in this email about how that her and this guy ended up at the same church in north central Ohio. Now, they were attending the same church decades ago in another state. She remembered him, but of course he was a clod, and he didn't remember her. So, they end up going to McDonald's for a cup of coffee after a Wednesday night Bible study. This is a totally new adventure. I'm going to read to you a part of her email. We met following Wednesday after Bible study at McDonald's, and I was so nervous, I was shaking. Now, this woman, by the way, she'd been married for 38 and a half years. She has plenty of life experience. She's sitting in a McDonald's across the table from a brother in the Lord. Why in the world would she be shaking with a cup of coffee in her hand? Anybody have a clue? What do you think? Emotional. It was new to her. This was a totally different experience. Despite her life experience, despite the fact that she was a Christian and was a person of faith, he was a Christian, and they knew one another years ago, she's sitting at McDonald's, hard to hold a cup of coffee in front of him. That's how uncomfortable, tense that it can be. Male-female relationships after loss can be very complicated. Well, she goes on to explain that they started enjoying one another's company some, and he went to Arkansas to visit with his family. While he was in Arkansas visiting with his family, she gets diagnosed with cancer. She knows what's going to happen now. He's going to leave her. But then she continues to tell the story about losing her hair, puking her guts out, and guess who was with her every step of the way? That brother in the Lord that she met. They ended up getting married. And I love the way this one ends too. She said, I never thought I could love someone else, and neither did he. Neat stories. Now, you're probably knowing or suspicioning where I'm going now, because there's a flip side to this coin. Sometimes it's not like that. As a matter of fact, these marriages after loss, either after divorce or after death, can be not dissimilar from first marriages. First marriages can be awesome, can be great. First marriages can also be a train wreck. The same thing is true with marriage after loss. Well, David sent me this email, and he was talking about when his father, in this email, he talks about his father, after his mother died, his father got remarried. And what was a real issue was how that marriage had affected his father's spiritual life. He wasn't at church as frequently. He wasn't in a visible way serving faithfully like he used to. And he was having trouble resenting the impact that this new woman had on his father's spiritual life. And so when they would be together, it would create some uncomfortableness in social settings. Well, there's this couple, Effie and John. They both lost their spouses, and they ended up getting married. Now, Effie found out that this was not a very wise decision when it became obvious to her, after she said I do, that he was a control freak. To the extreme that he would even control the TV shows that she watched on TV. But she said I do, until death do us part. So she's stuck. So they continue in their married life. Effie ends up getting dementia. John ends up a caregiver. So you know what he says? He says, I never envisioned my marriage to be like this. I got married to have a wife to take care of me, not for me to take care of a wife. You see, that's the flip side. The worst one I've ever run across is an elder's daughter who lost her husband and she remarried. This is a public Facebook post I'm going to read to you. Dear Facebook friends, I don't write very personal posts, but because most of my Facebook friends are like family to me, I want to tell you about the recent events in my life. I know that you've been concerned about me, and I appreciate more than you know. I appreciate your concern. She says, maybe this post will answer some of your questions and elicit some of your prayers. I think I can make everything clear. I'm just ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband Jim passed away in June of 2014. It forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone later, and we married July of 2015. Now note the timeline here. June of 2014, the loss. July of 2015, the remarriage. While that may seem very quickly to some of you, at the time I couldn't see that. I was lonely, and I should have never remarried so quickly. Does the word trapped come to mind again? Until death do us part. I don't go into a lot of details right now, but after several rounds of heartache with this person, I am now divorcing him. Being a teacher in a small town for 25 years lends itself to knowing many, many people. I am taking back Jim's last name. He was the love of my life and my soulmate. Please pray for me and Lexi as I continue to grieve for Jim and as I move forward from this very embarrassing situation. All of you know that all I ever wanted was a loving marriage like many of you have. Now, I share all that to drive home this point. Marriages after loss, whether it's a marriage after divorce or a marriage after death, can be magnificent. It can also be miserable. I say that and then add to that, every first marriage no matter what your age is, no matter how much life experience you have, no matter how long that you may or may not have been a Christian, a first marriage can be magnificent. It can also be miserable. It hinges on a lot of very important things, and I'm going to share some of those with you now. I want to ask you to think out loud together with me about this passage here. Some of you, I'm sure, have thought about, I know you've read, you've thought about, maybe even discussed in Bible classes, this passage of Scripture. Now, when you look at this passage of Scripture, there is an obvious indication of freedom. The one who's lost their mate by death has every right in the world. They're at liberty to marry again. Now, somebody tell me, what is the restrictive phrase in that verse? Only in the Lord. That is a restrictive phrase. Now, what does that restrictive phrase mean? How have you heard that explained?
Only in the Lord.
Only in the Lord. What does that mean? Only in the Lord. Somebody, a believer, a person who is in the Lord, a person who's become a Christian. Now, there's another possibility with that phrase. The only in the Lord could be, and there are a lot of things that have been written about this. And I just suggest that maybe you read some of these different perspectives. The only in the Lord phrase, it either refers to the person or it refers to the marriage. To be honest with you, I wouldn't stake the welfare of my soul on either one of those. I wouldn't be willing to say absolutely positively for sure it's either one. But I simply point out that the only in the Lord phrase could be a reference to the legitimacy of this marriage after loss. Not the person they're marrying, but the legitimacy of the marriage after loss. Now, the reason why I say that is you've got to remember this awesome blessing from the Lord, this opportunity to enjoy life married, is a choice and a wonderful blessing. But you have to realize that we human beings have the ability to take a blessing from the Lord and really mess it up. Just look at the statistics. There are a lot of mediocre marriages, there are a lot of miserable marriages, and there are way, way too many divorces. So we have taken in our culture a beautiful blessing from God, and we have the ability to really mess it up. And we can find ourselves in some very complicated marital history. The woman at the well in John chapter 5. 4 husbands. Well, why don't you go back and get your husband? A 5th husband. And the statement there at the well is, he's not your husband either. You know, a person can think they have a husband or a wife, and in the sight of God not have legitimately a spouse. It's how God views it that matters. I'm not going to get into the tall, thick weeds about marriage and divorce and remarriage and all that sort of stuff. I just want to point out that not everybody has the right to be married to just anybody else. As a matter of fact, when John the Baptizer got his head chopped off, we read about that in a couple of different places in the Gospels. In Matthew 14, what was it that John the Baptizer had the gall to say to Herod?
He should have his brother's wife.
It was unlawful for you to have your brother's wife. He had his brother's wife. He was married to his brother's wife. But it was not acceptable to God. Not all marriages are acceptable to God. This phrase could refer like an adverb. It's modifying the marrying. Or it could be more like an adjective kind of a phrase and modify the noun, the person that you're marrying. Now, which is it? Well, like I said, I wouldn't stake the welfare of my soul on either one. But here's what I think we should be able to all agree on. And I'm always about trying to encourage consensus. Would you agree with me that that is a restrictive phrase? No matter no matter which side of the fence you want to fall on in regard to what that means, it is a restrictive phrase. That only matters. Only in the Lord. Now, I think the safest route to pursue is honor both of those. that person be a Christian, and that person had a right to be married to you, and you have a right to be married. Eliminate the doubts. Address the caution flag here. That's what it is. It's like a caution flag. See, when we've gone through the experience of losing a spouse, we're not the same person. No human being goes through crises without being changed. When we go through difficult times in our life, we are changed. Now, initially, we don't have a whole lot of control over how we're changed. But in the long run, we do have a choice about who we become because of what we've experienced. We just need to realize that we've got to think about this, and if we're going to marry, let's marry the right kind of person, and us be the right kind of person to be married to that other person. We need to be that way the first time we get married, and we need to be that way if we lose our marriage and think about marrying again. Just be careful. Elizabeth Einstein made a good observation when she said the most critical key to marrying again is dealing with the loss of that first relationship, that first marriage. If you don't resolve the issues that you're going to inevitably have as a human being about the first relationship, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to be functioning as you should in another relationship. That takes time and that takes effort. Time doesn't heal. Hurt happens. Healing doesn't just happen. Healing happens when we actively pursue the things that help us heal. That's true physically, and that's true mentally, and that's true emotionally, and that's true spiritually. Hurt happens. Bad things are going to happen. If we heal from our hurts that we experience, it's going to be because we took the time to invest a lot of effort into that healing process. I love this observation. You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with somebody else. Now, let me ask you, if you have an issue and you're not okay with yourself about that issue, let's imagine that you have an eating disorder. Let's go that route. You have an eating disorder. And it does happen for a lot of complicated reasons. Okay, you've got the eating disorder. Now, you get up here and you say, I do. After you said, I do you still have the eating disorder? Okay. Now, what if the guy he's a real clod, and he's not interested in neat, okay? He has no problem living pretty much like a bum. I mean, he'll leave his clothes laying on the floor, and he doesn't care about much of anything. He just does his thing. Now, he says, I do. Is he going to become a clean freak? Is he going to be better about taking care of his clothes? No. You know, every person is a frail, mere mortal human being. And whenever we get married, we bring our brokenness, whatever degree of brokenness that we have, into that relationship. And we have to realize that just because we get married doesn't mean that our brokenness is going to disappear. We really need to work on ourselves prior to the time that we choose to commit ourselves to somebody else in a relationship. A really good book, and if you're a young person or an older person who's lost a first marriage, I really encourage the reading of this book. I love the title of it, Finding Your $1 Million Mate. I mean, who doesn't want a $1 million mate? Now, I'm not talking about a person who has $1 million. I'm talking about a jewel of a person. Now, the one thing that I think needs to be at the outset of this book, if I were going to write an extra chapter in this book, it'd be right in the front. Finding your $1 million mate. Do you know where that journey begins? It begins in the mirror. When you look at yourself, it begins with you developing yourself into $1 million mate for somebody else. Mm-hmm. We have to make sure that we're okay with ourselves. If we think that we're going to be okay just because we get married, we're naive and we're ignorant, because human beings don't roll like that in a broken world. Remarriage is even encouraged. Younger widows were encouraged to remarry. And how young is this young person? Well, it says that she's able to bear children, so maybe that provides a little bit of insight. But it's even encouraged. It's a natural thing. We human beings, we're social creatures to different degrees. We're all unique. But we might have that interest in that kind of relationship again. And it's even encouraged, not discouraged. It's encouraged in 1 Timothy 5. This is a key passage in regard to marriage. I know that we typically don't think about it this way, but I think it is. It's a very key passage in regard to marriage. It starts in verse 11, Philippians 4:11. I'm going to read through verse 13. Not that I speak in regard to me, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That last verse in verse 13 has been often lifted out of context, and I have done that. This is not talking about universally. You can do whatever you want to do, and the Lord's going to help you do it. Well, no. The context of that statement is made in the context of finding contentment in life. It's in that context he is saying, it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. You can be content in your life by the strength that Jesus Christ can afford you and the insight that he can give you about life in the fallen world. You can be content. Your contentment does not have to hinge on anything in this world of a physical nature. That's the context of that statement. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, I want you to look at this passage. And I'm going to be so bold as to insert some words in here, and I'm going to ask you if this is possible. It says, I have learned in whatever state I am. Now, before the word state, S-T-A-T-E, and it's not talking about like Washington, Ohio, Georgia. It's talking about condition, life condition. In whatever state I am. Okay, I'm going to start plugging in some words. In whatever financial state I am, to be content. Is that possible? Mm-hmm. Okay. Poor people can be content. Rich people can sometimes be the most discontented people in the world. It's not about finances. It's about Jesus. And about Jesus being the Lord of your life and leading you through life. Let me plug in another word. How about, I have learned in whatever physical state I am to be content. Now we're getting more personal. Can a person who's a diabetic be content? Let's get more brutal. Can a cancer patient be content? Can a person with ALS be content? Whatever physical state I am, yes, they can. Through Jesus Christ who can strengthen us to do that very thing. Now let me plug in another word. I have learned in whatever marital state, now we're really getting personal. I have learned in whatever marital state I am to be content. Can a person who's an adult, never married, be content? Can a person who has experienced divorce be content? Can a person who's experienced the loss of their mate by death be content? What's it hinge on? Jesus Christ. Our relationship with Jesus Christ. People have asked me, well, as if I were some kind of an expert, and I'm not. I'm a student of this subject. When is it that a widow or a widower is best able to be remarried, most likely successfully? I know what they're wanting when they ask that question. They're wanting a number. How many months? How many years? How in the world would I know that? I have come up with a response to that question. Here's my response. A widowed person is best prepared to be married when they have become content in their widowhood. Because then they're not marrying out of desperation. I have got to be married. I'll never be happy unless I'm married. But when we have struggled with our circumstances, struggled with our limitations, struggled with our perspective, worked on our relationship with the Lord, and we have gotten to the point where we are contented with our marital state, that's when we're best able to make a good judgment about marrying again. In that book, After the End Comes, that's back here on the table that I wrote, there's a chapter in there about male-female relationships after loss. And then there's another chapter right after that about marriage after loss. And I did a very transparent thing. I explained a little bit about my life after my wife died. Number one, I considered all females forbidden fruit. Now, no offense to you females, okay? But the reason I did that is because I knew I would be tempted to remarry to self-medicate my grief and my loneliness. Would that be a good thing for my marriage? Would that be a good thing for her? For that to be my motive? As if she were some sort of anecdote or some sort of antidote, I should say? No. I prayed real hard that the Lord would help me to become strong enough through Jesus Christ to be content with my widowhood. And I prayed and I prayed and I worked, and it took me a few years to get to that point. And I went from all women are forbidden fruit, I actually used that phrase, by the way, in the book, to, boy, I would love to be able to be married again. And I guarantee you I'll be a lot better husband the second time around. Well, it is a struggle to be content with some circumstances that you find yourself in that can really challenge your faith. Well, I think what we need to realize is there is a precious value to contentment, especially when it's combined to godliness. You want to have contentment, develop godliness. Godliness with contentment is great gain. And boy, that godliness with contentment can help you through every loss that you ever experience in your life. You're not always going to be happy. You're not always going to smile. But by the grace of Jesus Christ and the strength He gives you in that grace, you can handle any storm in your life. Now, what should be considered before marriage? Now, this applies first marriage, second marriage. I've talked to people who've been married more than 2 times. What should be considered? One thing we need to realize before we ever get married is there are myths in our culture about marriage. Don't buy into a myth. What you need to see is truth, not myth. Don't marry on a myth, because if you marry on a myth, you're marrying on a very unstable foundation. There's a book called Fit to be Tied, and in that book, there's a chapter where it talks about this very issue. What are some myths about marriage? Marriage will end my aloneness. Marriage will heal my brokenness. Marriage will ensure my happiness. And then, marriage is God's plan for everyone. Is there anybody in this room that knows an adult who's never married? Okay, yeah, we all know people. What's wrong with those people? Absolutely nothing. Marriage is for most people. It's not for everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay. They can serve the Lord. As a matter of fact, if you read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, they have a freedom and flexibility because they're single that really can be a treasured blessing in the Lord's ministry. Now, let me ask you this. Do you know anybody who's married who's unhappy? You know, that one up there that says, marriage will ensure my happiness? I mean, are you crazy? Do you honestly think? Well, but yeah, some people do. I'm an unhappy single person. I'm an unhappy widowed person. I'm an unhappy divorced person. If I get married, I won't be unhappy. No, marriage is not some sort of wonderful, mystical stick that you shake above your heads and it's all happiness. There are some miserable marriages, and there are some just mediocre, ordinary, run-of-the-mill marriages. The only kind of marriage that brings glory to God is a magnificent marriage. If you weren't here Friday and Saturday, I'm going to give it to you. For the first time, for those of you who were here yesterday or the day before, remember, total giving with a total self for a total lifetime. In a nutshell, that's how you have a magnificent marriage. 2 flawed people who are all in, total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. That's what makes a magnificent marriage. You can't have a perfect one. You can't take two flawed people and create a perfect thing. But you can take two flawed people, and by the help of the Lord, you can have a magnificent marriage that can be a real blessing to both of you. Now, I'm going to share with you, and we're going to just reel them off pretty quickly, some things that are really important to help ensure a magnificent marriage. And here's the number one thing. There's nothing more important than this. Spiritual compatibility. Would you like to help me find my new mate? I'll describe her to you. She loves somebody else more than she does me. You know who she loves more than me? She loves the Lord. Because that's the only kind of person I want to be. And that's the kind of person that if I were to marry that kind of person, I know this. It doesn't matter what the age difference might be, or the skin color might differ, or how the education level might differ. If you have spiritual compatibility with that other person, you have a marriage that involves three people. And the most important part of that relationship is the Lord. When both people are seeking to draw near to the Lord, they draw nearer to one another. They have a blueprint for life. They have a guide to deal with their prosperity. They have a guide to deal with their adversity. And they have the hope that can help them to navigate every ugly storm in their life together. Spiritual compatibility. There is nothing more important than that. If you want to find your $1 million mate, you seek to become a person who loves God more than anybody else or anything else, and then you go hunting for a person just like that. And that's how you can build a great marriage. If you have a marriage like that, if we have more marriages like that, we have a lot less divorces in our country. Time is the acid test of a relationship, because over time you learn who the real person is. My suspicion is here that you married folks, when you first met the person you ended up marrying, you kind of pretended a little bit. You did what we call, you put what foot forward? Your best foot forward. But over time, what do we find out? There's another foot besides the best one. You find out things over time. You know, that girl that I ended up becoming attached to at 15 years old and married at 19, that woman, she was real careful about one thing. I remember distinctly. There was one thing she was really careful about. I never saw her in hair rollers. Now, some of you young people, that's another one you're going to have to Google. Okay, now, after I said I do, I not only saw her in hair rollers, in hair curlers, I slept with that woman when she was like that. I mean, who knew? Now, there are things a lot more serious than that. Over a period of time, you're going to have experiences with this person. And over time, you're going to see how do they respond to adverse circumstances. What are they like when they get angry? Not everybody is happy-cheery all the time. Well, come to think of it, nobody is. How is that person when they're angry? How do they handle their money? How do they handle people that think differently than they do? How do they interact socially with other people? See, over time, you have experiences that give you insight into who that person really is. Time is the acid test of a relationship. So you find that woman I was telling you about that loves somebody else more than me, then give me some time, okay? I need time because she's not perfect, but she loves God more than anybody else. Okay, now, whenever you get married, you end up marrying into another family. Whether it's a first time or a time later than that. How about the blending? This woman that you're now commissioned to find for me, she's going to have to pass over 10 tests. I have 3 daughters. I have 3 sons-in-law. That's 6. I have 5 grandchildren. That's 11. I make a dozen. That's 12. And then there are 2 Australian Labradoodles in Gainesville, Florida, that are part of my family, who belong to my grandchildren. What woman is going to pass 13 tests? It's all pass-fail. But could you help me? You see the point I'm trying to make? See, that person, would you marry somebody that would cause you to become more relationally distant from your family? Now, some people will. Some people will do that. I know people who have done that. It's a very risky proposition, and you've got to be willing to deal with all of that. But family blending is something that has to be considered. Now, expectations are often impacted by the past. How does a boy learn to be a husband? Now, this is a scary thought. How does a boy learn to be a husband? What's he experienced that's given him a concept of what it's like to be a husband? He's watched his dad. Guys, isn't that kind of scary? Okay, how about a girl learning to be a wife? How does she learn about that? The first way she learns about that is she catches lessons. You know, it's not just all formal sitting down, hey, here's how a wife needs to be. Children learn more by what they caught in their life than what they're taught in their life, what they catch by their observation. And then if there's a previous marriage, then this woman that you're going to find for me, see, she's not going to be like my first wife. She can't be. Just like I'm not going to be like her first husband if she was married previously. And so you've got to realize that there are things that we're going to have to talk about here. There's a lot of transparent conversation that needs to go on. You know what the mark of a close relationship is? Transparency. You know how to cultivate close relationships with other people? Be transparent. Be obvious. Be honest. When we talk about some of these things in regard to our past, it opens up our insight and helps us to bring those 2 into that one flesh relationship more successfully. There's also health and sexual issues to consider. You know, sometimes, even when we're young and we've never married before, we might marry somebody who has a health issue. You know, they could have been diagnosed with juvenile diabetes, or maybe they have a cancer history. Kids get cancer too. And those things need to be considered. Is that something that you're willing to embrace as something that you might have to experience together? And then there are sexual issues. Some things need to be talked about very frankly that are very, very personal. And those things need to be talked about. Well, this really gets complicated. But let me explain to you about this woman that you're commissioned to find for me. Now, by the way, did I mention she's drop dead gorgeous? I forgot to mention that, I think. Okay. She's drop dead gorgeous. She loves the Lord more than anybody else or anything else. She's accepted by 11, 12 people and 2 dogs. And she's a millionaire. I just wanted to throw that one in there too. She's a millionaire. Now, we get married. She's a millionaire. We get married, but she dies first. Now, for the sake of comparison, I'm going to say she has 3 sons. I've got 3 daughters. She has 3 sons. She dies first. Do her 3 sons have to share their 1/3 of that $1 million with my 3 daughters? Now, let's say we get married and I die first. I've been a preacher all my life. I leave behind $1.50. Are my kids going to have to give a quarter to her 3 sons? There's a lot to be talked about that's very complicated. You know, there are financial goals, there are all kinds of accounts. You know, I can't believe I'm saying this, but when we came up with this crazy idea of prenuptial agreements, we read about people in Hollywood and some other people having these in first marriages. That is programming a marriage for failure is what it is. Now, having said that, there are some times that there are these adult children that are so concerned about their inheritance that sometimes to calm their fears and their, to put it bluntly, greed, you might want to devise a prenuptial agreement. I can't believe I'm saying that. But that's how complicated this can be. And sometimes there are children, especially adult children, who can be very problematic in regard to a marriage, again, because of their concern about things like wills and estates and insurances. Those things need to be talked about before two people say, I do. And where are we going to live? Now, this woman that you're going to find for me, I'm hoping she has a beach house on the Gulf down in Mexico. That'd be really cool. Or maybe one over where I could see Mount Rainier. That'd be nice too. Maybe she could have both. Well, are we going to live at my house or her house? Or are we both going to sell our places and we're going to buy one of our own? What are we going to do about that? The time to discuss that stuff is long before you say, I do. My oldest daughter got remarried. Her husband left her after 7 years of marriage. They got married when they were 22. He left her when they were 29. She left home one day to go to work and came back. He was in the shower, and when she came back, everything of his was gone. He disappeared. Just disappeared. Had no idea what happened to him. Months later, many months later, we finally found a guy who was doing his PhD in computer science at Auburn University, who I took the computer tower to, and we found out that he was heavily involved in pornography. There was an email in there about him asking for someone's, in an escort agency, someone's schedule and her fees, and there was a double life that was being lived. She lived alone for 17 years. She just got remarried June 24th. They ended up both selling their homes and buying one together. But those are things that have to be talked about before we say, I do. The whole point of what I've shared with you is the reality that with all human relationships, there's no exception to this, with all human relationships, there are risks. When you have a friend in your life, you are risking getting hurt. Because you know what people can do to people? People can hurt people. We neglect people. We sin against people. We make people angry. We make some people's life more difficult, even miserable. We human beings can be a blessing. We can also be a burden. Anytime there's a human relationship, there's one common factor with both parties in a partnership of two, in a friendship of two. Both of them are human. Nobody's perfect. So there are going to be times where there are going to be risks. Why do we risk the hurt of a friendship? Because we see the possibility of reward. You cannot, it is impossible to eliminate risks. It is not impossible to reduce risks. That's what I think we need to do as Christians especially. We need to reduce the risks of failure with marriage by considering things that are critically important to that marriage. Let me quote something out of that book that you saw earlier, Fit to be Tied. This is an exact quote. The most miserable people in the world. Does that catch your attention? The most miserable people in the world are not single people who want to be married, but married people who realize their marriage is a mistake. The most miserable people in the world are not single people who want to be married, but married people who realize their marriage is a mistake. H. Norman Wright wrote a book. So you're getting married? He says, some cannot bear the thought of remarrying. Some cannot bear the thought of remaining alone for the rest of their days. Yet they do not realize that a person can be married and still feel terribly lonely. We just need to be careful. I'm sure some of you are aware of that book, The 5 Love Languages, and Gary Chapman. I had no idea that, I thought he had a perfect marriage. Well, lo and behold, I find out he didn't. I was in a bookstore in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and I saw this book. When I saw this title, I had to get this book. Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Got Married. It's written by Gary Chapman. And in that book, he tells a little bit about the struggles they had early on in their marriage. And this book is really a very good, practical book with a lot of insight in it about things that people ought to know before they get married. My favorite, let me read you just a couple. How to solve disagreements without arguing. He said he would have liked to have known that before they got married. He has a section here about he wished he had known that forgiveness is not a feeling. And then he has another chapter in here that we needed a plan for handling money. I mean, who knew that? But this is my all-time favorite. Things I wish I'd known before we got married. That toilets are not self-cleaning. That's my favorite chapter. It's about, chores and divvying up the responsibilities when the two become one and you're living together. I really do encourage thoughtful reflection before anybody gets married. Remarriage, and this is the end, at midlife or later, is somewhat like the merger of two major corporations. T-Mobile and Sprint, it took a long time for them to get to the point where the two became one. Sometimes with these mergers, there's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of human resources involved in looking at all of the things that need to be looked at prior to a merger. And sometimes they'll back off. After they do this study and they invest all this money, they'll back off. Why? Because they find out this is not a good, wise decision. I think the same approach is the approach that we ought to take when it comes to marriage. We just need to realize that as we get older, and especially if we get to midlife or later, that there are complications that we need to make sure that we deal with. Yes, sir.
So I really take to heart your point about two people that are trying to get married again need to talk out the finances, talk out the various things. Would it be a corollary that the degree that someone holds back and is not fully forthcoming and fully genuine about their feelings about this or that should be a red flag?
And some people have even withheld information about their physical health from that other person. And then they don't find that out until after the I do. Or if they withheld that from you for a long period of time, but then only finally divulge it like the week before the wedding ceremony, what's that a sign of? That's a red flag. Yeah, we need to be very careful and have a lot of personal, transparent conversations. The bottom line is marriage can be an awesome experience, and it ought to be an awesome experience, and that's the way God designed it. Let's make it that way. But to make it that way, we just got to be real cautious about how we proceed down that road toward marriage. God bless you. God bless this wonderful church family, and I have been just so richly blessed by being here this weekend. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. If it were not for Sister Jarrett, I wouldn't be here. Sister Jarrett, I love you. I only met her in July of last year during the Faith Builders Northwest. And if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. You are such an inspiration to me. I am so thrilled to know you. You are blessed to have many good people in this church.
Amen.
I pray for the growth and the health of this church. Could we end our time together with a prayer? Let's do that. Father in heaven, thank you for the abundance of the blessings, the priceless value of those blessings, the fact that we don't deserve any of them, and yet you richly bless us. It's hard for us to comprehend, Father, how good you are. Father, it's with the realization of your magnificence, your glory, and your goodness that we submit to you in all of our lives. We submit to you, Father, our time of recreation and relaxation. We submit to you our time of work. We submit to you, Father, in regard to our worship and how we worship. We submit to you in regard to our social relationships with others. We submit to you in regard to our marriages and our lives. Father, we want to draw near to you. We're thankful that through Jesus Christ we can. Help us, Father, to keep resisting the devil as we draw near to you. Father, help us to never let the devil get a foothold in our life, to wring our life and make it such a mess. Help us, Father, to stay committed to drawing near to you. Thank you for this church. We pray, Father, for the health, the vibrancy, the ministries of this church. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.